You know that awkwardness at the IEP table where everybody introduces themselves, everybody's going around the table talking about your child or your student, talking about present levels of performance and all the great things that are happening and all the goals that are to come. And then there's the general education teacher. And a lot of times the general education teacher is disconnected from majority of the conversation. We can work together to change that. Let's talk about it on this episode of the Special Education Inner Circle podcast. I'm your host, Catherine Witcher. And if you have not been over to masteriepcoach.com lately, I'm going to encourage you to go over there. There are 2 Master IEP Coach paths there waiting for you. Today, I'm going to cover one of the key strategies that's inside of the Master IEP Coach Leadership Certificate. It's something that's really important to make sure that we have a complete IEP, which means that we have general education and special education teachers involved inside the IEP process on a regular basis, collaborating, working together. Parents are part of the conversation because so often we have general education teachers who do not feel prepared, they do not feel equipped, they do not feel confident that they can do what needs to get done for the students who are in their classroom who have different learning needs. So this is why, as a parent, your child might be going to inclusion, which that's another conversation for another day, talking about inclusion and its experience and not a place and how we reframework that conversation, right? But for this conversation, we can picture this, right? Child goes to inclusion and they're spending time in the general education classroom. And majority of the time, the general education teacher does not have a relationship with the parent. And so the parent has no idea what's going on. There's also a lot of disconnect from who's supposed to be doing what when it comes to that student being in the classroom. So let's talk about 3 strategies that you as a parent and a teacher can implement to get teachers, general education teachers, more involved in the IEP process without overloading them. And I know, the document is a legal document. We can absolutely say, the law says this has to get done. This is how it has to be. But I'm more about saying, how are we going to build this document so it's not a forced document, but it is something that, yes, we hold accountable, but people are excited, that the staff is excited, that the child is excited to learn and to be supported. And when we have buy-in on this document, we have much better execution and implementation of this document. So the first strategy that you need to get general education teachers more involved inside of the entire IEP process is to make sure that the box on the IEP that says supports for school personnel is checked, like as in check it yes, okay? And make sure that any supports that the general education teacher needs is in that section of the IEP. So if a child uses visual schedules or AAC or has anything adaptive or, anything that might not come naturally inside of a general education classroom, or maybe the teacher has not had a lot of exposure to it, we need to make sure that we're using this section on the IEP to support the general education teacher who needs to be trained and given the tools to feel confident to work with all students, especially this student that we're talking about, your child or your student, we're building this IEP. This section of the IEP is left empty on so many IEPs. I've worked on thousands of IEPs over the last 25 years, and I would say easily majority, as in over 80% of the time, this box is not utilized effectively inside of the IEP. So that's strategy number 1. Go get out your child's IEP or your student's IEP, go look for that box and say, okay, are we training the general education teachers to support this child in their classroom? And this doesn't have to be like a full day training one time, right? Where it's, full immersion, go learn all of these things. No, this can be something that's like 15 minutes of training every month to make sure that the teacher knows what the child's current present levels of performance are and what they should expect from this student in the upcoming month in their classroom. It can be as simple as, here's the visual schedules that we're using for this upcoming month. We are prompting this way. So this section's super important. Number 2, we can absolutely get general education teachers involved in data collection. It can be done in a really simple way. This isn't something that we have to sit down one-on-one with a student and, make tally marks on a sticky note, which is great because that would help develop a relationship between the teacher and the student, but that's not always feasible. So it can be as simple as you could have bingo chips in one pocket, and every time that the student is asking a question or starting their work without needing multiple prompts or their whatever this target desired outcome that we want in the general education classroom, they could be moving the chips from one pocket to another pocket, extremely discreet. And then at the end of the class, they could count those chips and then write it down and communicate with the special education teacher. And you can take data for engagement. This doesn't always have to, fall back on one of the special education team members. This is something that we can get general education teachers involved in, and then they feel ownership of the outcome. And we make it simple, so it's not something additional that they have to do. Oh my gosh, I legally have to take this data, and it's something else. That's just the feeling. It just happens. So if we can kind of take away that pressure of you have to do more and more and more and more and say, here's how we can do this in a really simple way. This is the desired outcome for the student in this classroom. We need to take data on this. So if you could, let's come up with a plan, right? Like if you could come up with a plan, let's work on this plan of how can we make sure this is happening in your classroom? And get the general education teacher involved, bring some simple data collection strategies and get them, excited about the outcomes, because then they start to see progress that maybe they wouldn't have seen if they weren't involved in the data collection. All right, third strategy, here we go. We have to get the buy-in from general education teachers when it comes to creating goals. Maybe not all IEP goals. They don't need to be involved in everything, but there's a lot of areas within the IEP that could use the perspective of a general education teacher. Sometimes in our special education kind of world, we see the perspective of what's happening in our life and our daily routines. But we're not seeing what's happening out there in the general education routines or what's going on with their peers and what might be a helpful skill inside that classroom and inside, getting ready for the next school year. If the child's in fourth grade, ooh, you know what? We could really work on this. And the general education teacher is going to have a perspective of ooh, we could really work on this because in fifth grade, they're going to have to start using lockers. There are things that can be more forward thinking in a different way from a general education perspective than we might not think about that from our special education perspective. So getting general education teachers involved in the goals, again, also gives them ownership for outcomes. It gets them more involved in the IEP discussion so we don't have those awkward moments at the IEP table of are they going to say anything? Do they know who the child is? All of that happens. That's just a reality, but we can change that reality. You can change that reality. Let's just recap it super quick, right? Number one, you're going to start using that box, supports for school personnel. You're going to use that to its fullest extent on the IEP. So inside of that paperwork. And if you're like, I didn't even know that existed, I've got more things for you inside of the Master IEP Coach Leadership Certificate, where you're going to find all these boxes that you're going to know how to use in the most effective way. So that's number one. Number two, you're going to get the general education teacher involved in collecting data so they have ownership of outcomes, and you're going to get them involved, number three, in IEP goals so they can help bring their perspective of what is really important to prepare this child for further education, employment, independent living, and how that would look in their classroom and the classrooms going forward. If you are thinking, I not only want to know all of these things, that's the Master IEP Coach Leadership Certificate, but I also want to be the person who helps parents through the IEP process. That was my full-time job. I worked for myself, still work for myself, and I want to help you work for yourself, helping parents through the IEP process. That's called Becoming a Master IEP Coach inside of the Mentorship and Network. I'll make sure that link is there below. If you're nodding your head yes during any of this and you're like, we need these strategies inside my child's team, or, we need more of this at our school, could you go ahead and like, comment, share this episode out with others who need to hear it. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, if you could leave a 5-star review, that would be fantastic. It helps more than you know. That little thing of just leaving a review, it helps so much. I'll see you guys next time on the Special Education Inner Circle podcast.